Once there was a man who had a vision of God as he dreamed one night. In this vision, God asked him to push a massive boulder outside his bedroom window. God told him to use all his strength and never stop. He woke up, went outside, and started pushing the rock with all his might. But it didn't budge. Days and weeks and months passed, but the huge rock wouldn't move. His morale plummeted, and he started losing his mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical strength. Doubts gnawed at him, and he wondered if his efforts would be in vain. Bushed and brokenhearted, he sat down against the warm rock and closed his eyes. A man trying to push a rock and our reading from Isaiah have something in common. Let's take a look. Exhaustion takes many forms in our world. It's most often experienced physically. Our body exhibits signs of exhaustion. We're cranky and achy. Our muscles feel weak. Our body is sluggish. We're driving along the highway late at night, and we keep nodding off, and we have to slap ourselves awake in order to make sure we get to our destination safely. To counteract these symptoms, there's really a pretty simple remedy. We just need more sleep. We once thought 8 hours of sleep was enough to be rested, but we are now discovering that it's more like 9 hours. Doctors recommend that you go to bed 15 minutes earlier each evening until you find out the right amount of sleep that your body needs. Changing our diet can also help with physical exhaustion. We may be eating the wrong foods. Our portions may be too large, and we may discover that we need to cut back or even eliminate caffeine or alcohol. Adding exercise to our daily routine also helps with physical exhaustion. It sounds counterintuitive until we realize that it only takes 10 minutes of walking for endorphins to start releasing into our body and lowering our stress levels. Exercising helps our body be more energetic and less tired, strange as that may sound. Sometimes we experience physical exhaustion and can take different remedies to address it. Other times, we may feel exhausted mentally. We can't focus, our concentration's off, our mind is fuzzy. We have trouble remembering familiar things like phone numbers and names of friends. Didn't I marry you? What is... Not just our muscles can get tired, so can our brains. To counteract mental exhaustion's effects, we need to keep our blood sugar levels within a certain range. And that means eating grains and legumes, fruits and vegetables, and not a candy bar and soda. Processed foods may give us a sugar buzz, but then we crash. Whereas fruits and vegetables, grains and legumes are digested more slowly, and they keep our blood sugar levels stable. Other methods of counteracting mental exhaustion include hobbies, creative outlets like painting or writing, or listening to music. Sometimes we experience mental exhaustion and can use various remedies to address it. At other times, we're emotionally exhausted. Relationships we once nurtured don't get the attention they need. We say caring words, but our heart's just not in it. Or we know we're supposed to care about the latest disaster in the world, but we just have what's called compassion fatigue. How do we counteract emotional exhaustion? Well, by paying closer attention to the relationships we have. Perhaps by talking to a counselor or therapist, or by joining in a local project that addresses community needs. It's easy to be overwhelmed, and if you turn on the news, listen to the radio, by global disasters, it is easy to just sort of throw up your hands. But that's no reason not to get involved at the local level in community projects like our X Days earlier this year and make a difference locally and visibly and tangibly for people that we know just around the corner. Even if our compassion is fatigued in the beginning of our project, being around other people who are committed to a charitable cause for a good reason, some of that excitement and enthusiasm and fire can rub off from them onto us, and we can get recharged through that process. Sometimes we experience emotional exhaustion and use different remedies to address that. Exhaustion comes in many forms: physical, mental, and emotional. We've all known what it's like to be wearied to our bones. Israel certainly knew what it was like to be tired. We heard it repeatedly in our passage. Israel is faint, powerless, weary, exhausted. Just saying those adjectives can suck the energy right out of you. What is the cause of such fatigue? The leadership of Israel has been forcibly removed from Jerusalem and deported to Babylon, there to go to re-education camps for indoctrination. Say it with me: Marduk is Lord. King Nebuchadnezzar rules the earth. Babylon is the center of the world. I've got to work with you people some more. Separated from their homeland, cut off from their compatriots, the exiles were exhausted from trying to hold their faith community together. There was physical exhaustion. Daniel and his 3 friends were part of the exiled leadership of Israel, brought for a re-education into King Nebuchadnezzar's palace itself. They were supposed to eat the food and drink from the king's royal table, rich and unclean foods and wine that were part of their royal ration. Daniel and his friends begged off and instead asked for vegetables and water. At the end of 10 days, he and his companions looked better than those who had been receiving the royal rations. The exiles also suffered from mental exhaustion. With the direct and indirect barrage of Babylonian propaganda day in and day out, they needed to keep their wits about them and to preserve their faith community. They knew some in their community would be tempted to capitulate, to just simply give up their faith. Others would seek to integrate, to forget their exile status and become willing citizens of Babylon. The vast majority, it was hoped, would neither capitulate nor integrate. They would have a far more challenging task: to navigate between 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 worlds, 2 ways of living. The community would need its best minds and most focused concentration in order to navigate the best course forward. Mental exhaustion was another reality for those exiles. The exiles also faced emotional exhaustion. They could never forget Jerusalem. But as long as they were pining for it, their present lives would be pitiful. Their exile was to last 70 years. 70 years of moping and whining and feeling bad about things and, oh, how it used to be, would be toxic to the heart of the exiles. Such emotional exhaustion could extinguish the community. That's why these words from another prophet, Jeremiah, to the exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon are so important. Jeremiah says, build houses, plant gardens, take wives and have children, multiply there and do not decrease. Seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, for in its welfare you will find your own. Instead of tearing down Babylon, they could build houses there. Although they've been uprooted, they're to plant gardens. Although separated from families back there, they're to create new families here. Rather than being woeful, they can seek the welfare of the city they're in. God knows that if their hearts are stuck there in the past, complaining about all they've lost, they'll miss their present blessings, even in exile, and not be able to go the distance for the future. Emotional exhaustion was another threat that Israel faced. The people in exile knew what it was like to be tired. The greatest threat that Israel faced wasn't any of these types of exhaustion, however. To counteract physical exhaustion, they could simply modify their diet. To counteract mental exhaustion, they could draw their community closer so they could navigate their way between two cultures and resist the temptations to capitulate or integrate. To counteract emotional exhaustion, they'd loosen the ties of their longing for Zion in order to make the best of their times in Babylon. Each of these things they could do for themselves, but another type of weariness threatened them, for which they had no remedy: spiritual exhaustion. We heard it in the passage from Isaiah where God is quoting the people. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? They're accusing God of either being unable to see their predicament or paying no attention to their troubles. God is either powerless or doesn't care what's happening to them. Because their spiritual exhaustion wasn't something they could fix themselves, they needed a prophet like Isaiah to speak the word of the Lord to them. And the Lord, speaking through the prophet, begins rebutting the accusations that Israel has brought before God. Even the way the question is framed begins that rebuttal process. Israel has accused God of paying no attention to their troubles. Yet God gives a verbatim quote of their accusation. My way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by God. If this were a John Grisham courtroom drama, this would be one of those moments where God's lawyer, the prophet Isaiah, would say to the plaintiff Israel on the witness stand, you say my client pays no attention to you. Yet here God provides a direct quote from your own lips. Would you care to explain? And lots of murmuring voices would be heard throughout the courtroom as the judge banged his gavel. Isaiah continues his defense of God. You accuse my client of paying you no attention, yet God sits above the earth observing its inhabitants, who are like grasshoppers to him. You accuse my client of paying you no attention, yet God numbers each star and calls them all by name. If my client knows the place and name of every star in the universe, and the astronomers have estimated at this point the running tally is a septillion, that's one with 24 zeros behind it, how much more so does God know the place and name of each of his children on earth? And Israel would have nothing to say from the witness stand. You've also accused my client of being powerless to help you. Could a powerless God stretch the heavens like a curtain or a tent to live in? Lift up your eyes and see who created these. You accuse my client of being powerless to help you in Babylon, yet even so-called rulers of earth like Nebuchadnezzar are no more than stubble in the storm to the Lord. Have you not known? Have you not heard? My client is great in strength and mighty in power. He does not faint or grow weary, and his understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and grow weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint. Tell me, O Israel, to whom will you compare my client, or who is like God's equal? And with these closing words of the attorney Isaiah, the courtroom erupts in pandemonium as the judge dismisses Israel's case against God. The most dangerous weariness that Israel faced was spiritual exhaustion. It wasn't something they could rectify on their own. They needed help from God, and they found it in the words of a prophet. Maybe spiritual exhaustion is our greatest danger too. The term in classical Christian spirituality for this life-robbing dreariness is acedia, from the Greek word akadia, which means lack of caring. It's feeling apathy toward our spiritual lives, a joylessness that despairs of the glory to which God calls us. Acedia shrivels our vision of God's goodness and love, and we lose hope. Because we're spiritually tired, we're unable to delight in God, and thus unable to glorify God. We can remedy our own physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion, but when it comes to spiritual exhaustion, however, we're in the same boat as those exiles in Babylon. Hear the prophet's words, which are God's words to us who are exiles in America. While in exile, resist the re-education efforts of the Babylon in which we live. Do not capitulate and give up hope. Do not assimilate and forget that you're in exile, not a citizen of Babylon. Pray for its welfare, but do not forget where your true home is. Learn to navigate between two different cultures, two different stories, two different ways of life. It will require your best minds and most focused concentration to chart your way forward. Don't mope for what's been lost, but seek the welfare of the city where God has sent you. the mission God has given us of being disciples of Christ among a growing community, of being a growing place for mission, was intentionally designed to stretch us beyond our present capacities. Something we can accomplish on our own isn't a mission. It's a goal. Something we can mark off on our checklist as done and then move on. A mission, however, is by design bigger and grander than we can achieve on our own. Something like funding a full-time youth associate pastor and new construction when we presently don't have money in hand. Both of these efforts, however ambitious, however big, are goals to help us achieve our mission. Both stretch us, our wings, if you will, and both are required to propel us forward in mission. One wing isn't enough for us to fly. We need two for us to reach our full wingspan, to stretch ourselves beyond our limits and discover ourselves borne aloft by the pinions of the Lord's strength bearing us up. Folks, if we could fly this mission on our own, we wouldn't need God's help, would we? Achieving our mission sometimes is like taking a flying leap of faith, trusting that God will bear us up. At other times, the mission God has given us of proclaiming the good news to the whole creation, of making disciples of all nations, of being witnesses to the ends of the earth, may seem at times like being told to push a massive rock. It requires all our strength. Sometimes we wonder if our efforts are in vain because the boulder doesn't budge. We forget, however, that God's command was for us to push against the stone, not move it. God's command is for us to use all our strength and never stop. We'll find that in the process of exerting ourselves, our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual muscles are made stronger. And we're worked out and ready to take on the world, even transformation for God's mission in our community. Our task is to keep pushing. It's God who's in the business of moving stones, as God did that first Easter morning. The movement of that stone continues transforming our world and encouraging us to discover that we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Keep pushing. Keep pushing, church. Thanks be to God. Amen.